Ah, yes. Only I wasn't in Rock Follies. I wouldn't have minded being in Rock Follies, actually, but it was, I mean, that was, I just started on radio about that time, and I thought it was the most wonderful TV show. But it was unusual. Rock Follies wasn't like anything that had gone before.
No, it was way ahead of its time. We were the sort of precursors of the Spice Girls. You know, three girls trying to make a go in the rock world had never happened before.
You could do it now as the old Spice Girls.
Well, I've often suggested, you know, the three little ladies 25 years, 40 years on, or whatever it was. Anyway, the magic of the show was not only fantastic scripts by Howard Schumann, music by Andy Mackay from Roxy Music, and being taught dance by David Taguri, who was a very famous Japanese choreographer who originally choreographed Hair. And then fantastic fantasy sequences. I mean, I remember in one of the first episodes, which was called Stairway, the number, and they had these three huge white staircases going up as high as the rafters here in the studio at Thames. And we were in full evening dress, stiletto heels. There were no barriers to the sides of the staircase, so that there was no top. And we were supposed to elegantly descend, the three of us, singing in harmony, well, to a backing track, obviously, trying to keep balance on these stiletto shoes and not trip over your dresses. It was absolutely terrifying.
But did you actually like each other? I know Julie Covington around that time really stood cry from the Argentina.
The best version ever.
It was. Oh. It was the best version. I totally agree with that. I think it's fantastic. But did the three of you actually get on? Did you like each other, or indeed you have to like each other to work together?
You know, there were two series. The first one was The Little Ladies Against the Rest of the World, and the second series was War Within the Little Ladies. And it's always difficult when you've got a threesome, a triangle, the sort of twos and the one change all the time. And because Julie was, I mean, she had the voice of an angel. I don't think I've ever heard anybody sing in the same way that Julie sings. And even now, listening to her songs, they bring tears to my eyes. And we knew pretty quickly that Charlotte and I were going to be relegated to the sort of harmony queens, and she would have all the best single numbers. So there was a little bit of war between us sometimes, but basically, no, we adored each other.
Yeah, no, that's good. Something we were talking just now about Hair, which you have an awful lot.
And it's real.
Yeah, no, that's definitely real. I mean, no question about that. No Joe Collins here. Right, so, no, I mean, there is a ton of it, but it was partially your hair that probably got you the gig in the United States, where people thought you were famous. The Alberto VO5 shampoo, where you're saying, I'm Rula Lenska, so all America thought, well, if you say your name, you must be well known.
But also underneath, I'm Rula Lenska, it was written International Star of Stage, Screen, and whatever, which was complete rubbish.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd done quite a lot of work in England, but nothing in the States. And anyway, they liked the English accent in America, and there were about 16 of these little mini commercials, which were like films. And finally one night, Johnny Carson, who was a very famous chat show host, one night on his show said, "Who the hell is Rula Lenska?" And from there, a sort of predominantly gay fan club started, and they had Rula Lenska look-alike days, and I mean, all sets of rules that you have to follow, which are in the book. And then a very famous comedian called Steve Allen used to have an hour-long sort of review show once a month, and they flew me out secretly to LA, and I was looked after like the star I was pretending to be. And secretly, they got me into the set, and for some reason, huge live audience and a swimming pool right in the middle of the set. And Steve Allen was wearing a long kaftan, animal print kaftan, long red wig, looking like me, sitting in front, well, trying to look like me, sitting in front of a mirror with those little light bulbs around the edge, and saying, "I use Alberto VO5 to make my voice deeper." And then I stepped out from behind the mirror and I said, "You're not Rula Lenska, I am." And he got such a shock that he fell into the swimming pool.
Did that not make you think, let's try and break America off the back of that? Because you become famous for being famous, as they say now.
Yeah, but I had a 10-month-old baby. I couldn't afford to bring everybody over there. And you know, in America, more than anywhere else, out of sight, out of mind. I did meet some amazingly famous people, and there were lots of promises. And I very nearly got the Colbys. But they demanded that they would decide when I was going to have facial enhancement. And I said, no, thank you, I'll decide if I'm going to do that.
You don't need facial enhancement.
Well, this was 30 years ago.
Oh, my goodness me. Well, that's America for you, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Gee whiz, that is...
So now, since then, apart from the commercial, but people still remember it.
Yeah,
so I said to the publishers of the book, why don't you send them a copy and say 40 years on, I've still got my own hair, yeah. And let's do it in environmentally friendly packaging, because I'm very environmental orientated. But I think they're all dead now, all the people I
do they still sell Alberto VF5?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, in which case you could go back and say, look what it's done for me, because you still look great, you'd be perfect. That'd be a good selling point.
I could do that. Let me just tell you one more story about hair. First film interview I ever went up for was with Michael Winner, God rest his soul. And it was to play a part of a scantily dressed lady in one of his horror films. And travelling to the venue, I was late, I grabbed a cab, I was wearing skin-tight white satin trousers, this was quite a long time ago, and a white top, the hair then was down to there, hastily putting my makeup on in the back of the cab. He went over a curb, and I spilt brown foundation all the way down my top and right across the crotch of my white satin pants, so you can imagine what it looked like. The only thing I could think of, because I didn't have anything else to change into, was to turn the trousers back to front. Which from the back, of course, looked even worse. So I'm invited to stand outside Mr. Winner's room, and the door is ajar, and I can see him at his table with both legs up on the table with a huge cigar in his mouth. And I'm standing at the doorway, you know, being very careful that he can't see my back, holding my portfolio of photographs. And finally he puts the phone down and he said, well, you're going to stand there all day? I said, oh, sorry, Mr. Winner. Sit down then. Never took his feet off the table. He said, let's have a look at your photographs then. So I gave him photographs. He had to look through. He said, is that a wig you're wearing? I said, no, Mr. Winner, it's my own hair. He said, it looks like a bloody wig. And I didn't get the job because I wasn't well endowed enough in other female areas.
He was a lad, Michael Winner, wasn't he?
Wasn't he just?
Extraordinary. But you, I mean, in your early days, worked and grabbed and trained with Julian Fellows. So I would have thought that Julian Fellows would have had you as a shoo-in for Downton Abbey. Absolute shoo-in.
Well, I keep suggesting to him every time I see him that he should write a part for some Russian or Hungarian countess. Yeah. And the last time I asked him, he said, if you only knew, darling, how many people ask me that question. He's got quite hoity-toity.
Has he?
Yeah. Ever since his OBE. But what a series. I'd give my right arm to be in that.
Yeah. No, that would be absolutely ideal. I mean, you'd be brilliant in that. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, you write. Let's start a petition.
We'll start a petition.
We'll start a petition. Rula Lenska of a Downton. Right, we'll start tweeting tomorrow. Brilliant stuff. Yeah, but you were talking about being a Hungarian countess, but I mean, you are a countess. Your father was a count, your mother was a countess. Unusually, people often buy titles. They want to be someone. We aspire. People want MPs. They work at their OBs, their CBs, their knighthoods. You, on the other hand, renounced yours, which is unusual.
Well, you know, Countess Rula sounds like a stripper, doesn't it?
A lot of money in it.
There's a lot more than in the acting world. But no, my real name is Róża Maria Laura Leopoldina Monika Olbińska.
I'm pleased you differently.
As you can imagine, I mean, you know, trying to crack the acting world, or any world with a name like that, unless you're in Poland, is pretty hard. And why brag about something that really doesn't belong here? Yes, if the war hadn't happened, if I'd been brought up on these amazing estates that my grandfather used to own, when my mother talked about them, as far as the eye could see, it was the Tarnowskis. So there were cart farms, there were vodka factories, there were hospitals, there were orphanages, there was schools, everything you could possibly think. And my mother, as a young girl, thought that this was the world. And she talked with amazing love and fondness about those pre-war years. And even though they were enormously grateful, and so am I, that England took us in, and we've had a wonderful wonderful life here, but my soul is definitely Polish. And when I went for the first time in 1989, just as communism fell, it felt a bit like my soul was coming home.
Do you have a place there? Do you buy somewhere in Poland?
No,
So you've got a home.
we're trying to reclaim some properties taken away from my family by the communists, but it's a very long, hard struggle. And this is only compensation, not actual worth.
So you've been getting somewhat compensation from the Polish authorities. Yeah. Is there a likelihood? How far down the line are you with it?
Oh yes, we've already got a bit, but you know, they're renting out lands that used to belong to my family, they're renting out buildings that used to belong to my family, and they're taking the rent, which isn't really fair, is it?
No.
Except, I mean, we would never throw people out that didn't have anywhere else to go to, but land and small plots of land which are being used as car parks, for example, is a very lucrative business.
Do you have to go there to take them on? Yes, I'm representing you, or can you do it at arm's length? I mean, it's
no, I have an amazing man who specialises in this sort of work, and it's no win, no fee, but he does take 25%
of the land.
But he's done pretty well so far, and he said to me, not if, but when all this comes to fruition, you will never have to work again, nor will your daughter. But I can't guarantee it'll happen in your lifetime.
When you won't be working anyway, so that's how. So what will you get? You'll get a heck of a lot of land, buildings, property.
Well, no, it would be compensation. We couldn't actually get the property.
Oh, you couldn't.
But it could be megabucks.
Yeah. But
so
do they assess that?
Stay in with me, kid.
Do they assess what it's worth now, or what it was worth then?
No, the goalposts keep changing.
Yeah.
Oh, certainly not what it was worth then. It's worth much, much more now, because then it was outside the outskirts of Warsaw, the capital.
Right.
Now it's within and one of the best areas.
Have you stayed close to your family? I can see this flicking through the book. I say the picture of your father, he actually looks a very warm and loving man, so you're obviously very close to him.
All my family is incredibly close. I mean, it's a very Eastern European thing. My father was in the diplomatic service before war broke out, so he was out of Poland before. And my mother escaped in 1939 with half an hour left to pack her most important possessions. She took little bits of jewellery, her record collection, and photographs, not even a spare pair of knickers. They escaped from Romania to Yugoslavia, where they were for 3 years, this is my mother's side of the family, under the Italian occupation, beautifully looked after by the Yugoslavs. And then when Germany invaded, they were arrested, and everybody over the age of 16 and under the age of 60 was sent to concentration camp. My mother was in Ravensbrück with her mother and one of her sisters for 2.5 years. Horrendous life. Then she was rescued by General Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross and taken for rehabilitation to Sweden. Meantime, my father had been adjutant to General Sikorski, who was killed in that infamous plane crash in Gibraltar. And then after the Battle of Monte Cassino, my mother went to Rome, and it was a dynastic marriage. It wasn't a love marriage. It was just two very high aristocratic families getting together, as they did in the old days, hoping that one day they would go back to Poland. And they came over here as penniless refugees, not even speaking the language. My mother talks about those early days as being incredibly hard, because she'd never ever had to do anything for herself, apart from concentration camp, which was horrendous.
Did she talk about that? Because so many people say when they went through a war, First or Second World War, any conflict, they often say, we can't get them to talk about it. They just clam up and they don't want to speak about it.
She would have had to have had a couple of glasses of wine She often talked about pre-war Poland, but about the bad things that happened, no. And then she happened to give, when I was at the sort of height of well-knownness with Rock Follies, she gave a 5-hour audio interview to a BBC journalist, because they were then interested in doing a programme about 3 generations, going back to Poland. And she talked so beautifully, in English, but with her incredibly strong Polish accent. And quite a lot of the extracts are in the book. And there she opened up to this interviewer, because, I don't know, I suppose it's much more difficult to talk about emotionally hard-wrenching things to people who are close to you.
But she must have loved the fact, or both your parents must have loved the fact that you made it and you were successful, because it almost gives you a sense of pride back that you've had taken away from you.
Well, in a way, except that my father thought that being actress was like being prostitute. I mean, there is a similarity, I suppose. He wanted me to go to the United Nations, because I speak 4 languages. They didn't really think that it was a suitable job for a lady of quite high background. Of course, when I started working, they were always hugely supportive. But I think they would have preferred that I'd gone on to something slightly highbrow.
Talking just now, the Duke of Edinburgh, you have a Duke of Edinburgh story. You must have met as well, a lot of the royals.
I've met more or less all of them. I was very privileged to work with Princess Diana for the Red Cross, and I was sent to Budapest to visit the displaced people's homes. So that was as close as I ever saw to something similar to concentration camp. With Fergie, we ran a charity called Angels, which started just in Poland, but then spread throughout the whole of Eastern Europe. And she came out with me to open a respite home for chronically ill children in Silesia. And we had a whale of a time. It was a great fun bird. And actually there's a sweet story here. The cultural capital of Poland is Krakow. And there is a huge, it's not a cathedral, but it looks like one, on the corner of the main square. And on the hour, every hour, they play a trumpet from north, east, south, and west. Live, it's not recorded. And this harks back to the 13th century, when the Tatars used to attack Krakow on a regular basis. And there were wooden palisades all around the small town then. And as soon as the trumpeter saw the attack starting to happen, he would rush up to the tower and play this short memory. And it plays exactly like that now. And it stops at the moment when his throat was pierced by a Tatar arrow. And every time I go, it still makes me cry. Anyway, on this particular night, Fergie and everybody else were in a restaurant having a sort of farewell meal. And as it was approaching midnight, I thought, I've got to get her into the town square to hear this. So it was about 10 to. I grabbed hold of her hand, rushed out the restaurant into the town square, and they thought we were trying to get away without paying. But with the Duke of Edinburgh, I was doing the Royal Variety performance, and I was playing Rita Hayworth. Gloria Hunniford was playing Doris Day, and Stephanie Lawrence, who's no longer with us, was playing Marilyn Monroe. And afterwards, when you line up backstage to meet the Queen and the Duke, and you're sort of, I always thought, lined up in order of, fame or importance or whatever. And to my horror, don't tell her this, please, Joan Collins was at the top of the lineup, and I think she's fantastic, but Dame Anna Neagle, who was one of my great heroines, was about 10 places below Joan Collins, which I thought was a bit unfair. Anyway. So Gloria and Stephanie and myself there, and the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen passes us, says something sweet, waves her hand and moves on. The Duke comes up to us, and his traditional arms behind the back, and he starts saying, my 3 favourite ladies, and particularly Rita Hayworth. I used to adore her, who made the dress and all the rest of it. by which the time the Queen had got to the head of the lineup and there was a bit of a lull, and you suddenly heard, Philip! But I have an enormous amount of respect for the royal family.
And you remember the famous one of the variety show with Charlie Cooper, when he said, "Excuse me, Larry," he said, "do you like football?" And she said, "No, not much." He said, "Could I have your cup final tickets?" You had to be reasonably cheeky to do that, weren't you?
Oh, wonderful.
But you're talking about your family just now, and obviously you have great affection for them. But you have your book out. We're talking about poetry. Your auntie or great auntie wrote poems?
My great aunt, who was in fact also in concentration camp, she died 3 years ago at the age of 97. She was the most adorable, eccentric, wonderful woman. And she wrote a series of poems when she was in the Middle East during the war. And until she died, she lived in this dilapidated house in Putney with everything falling to pieces. There was no central heating, piles of books in one corner, piles of egg cartons in another corner, because something might come in useful. Never got rid of anything. Yeah. She used to feed the foxes in her back garden with coffee. And she used to feed the spiders in her toilet. And she was the most enchanting, delicious person you could ever hope to meet. And she died holding my hand. She was a great, great friend of my mother's, and that affection translated into me, who I'm very like my mother as well.
Did she instill a lot of poetry? Because she read poetry.
She read poetry. She wrote the most beautiful love letters. She just instilled a love of words and a love of language, and particularly Polish, because although I speak it fluently, and I do read it and write it, but I can't skim through a Polish book like I can through an English book. It takes a little bit more concentration, and I do occasionally have to have a dictionary with me.
I know you've got a poem or two from your great aunt. Are these in English?
Is there anybody here who's Polish?
Yes, they're there.
Oh,
no,
one, okay. Well,
and at the back.
This is just for you, then. I think I'll have to pretend that I put my glasses on. That's fine. Okay, I'll read you two. They're very short. The first one is by Wisława Szymborska, who won the Nobel Prize in 1996. And it's called Niektórzy lubią poezję, which means some people like poetry. Niektórzy, czyli nie wszyscy, nawet nie większość wszystkich, ale mniejszość, nie licząc szkół, gdzie się musi, i samych poetów, będzie tych osób chyba 2 na 1000. Lubią, ale lubi się także rosół z makaronem. Lubi się komplementy i kolor niebieski. Lubi się stary szalik. Lubi się stawiać na swoim. Lubi się głaskać psa. Poezję. Tylko co to takiego poezja? Niejedna chwiejna odpowiedź na to pytanie już padła. A ja nie wiem i nie wiem i trzymam się tego jak zbawiennej poręczy. Do you want a quick translation?
Yes.
More or less? Okay. So it says some people, meaning not all, not even the majority, more like the minority, not counting schools, not counting when you have to, and poets themselves, don't really like or understand poetry. They like it sometimes, but they also like chicken soup with barley. They like compliments, they like the colour blue, they like a favourite old shawl, and they like to stroke a dog. Poetry. Well, what is poetry? There have been many, many questions asked about this, but I, as a poet, I say, I don't know, and I just hold on to the belief that what I write is poetry, and pray that it is.
Excellent. Excellent.
And this is one written by my great aunt. Kiedy odejdziesz ode mnie, to nagle w sercu się stanie ogromnie cicho i sennie. Ubędzie słońcu promieni I wlecze będą godziny, choć niby nic się nie zmieni. Kiedy odejdziesz ode mnie, choć niby nic się nie zmieni, dni będą smutne i długie, jak w Polsce podczas jesieni. Which means, when you will leave me, suddenly in my heart, it will become enormously quiet and sad. The rays of the sun will no longer shine, and the hours will drag so slowly, although on the face of it, nothing really much will change. But when you go away from me, although not many things will actually change, the days will be sad and long, like Poland during autumn.
Yeah. Well, let's come back down to earth now from Nobel Prize poetry to celebrity Big Brother. I mean, your father didn't like you going into this business.
Oh my God, he would have hated that.
Really, absolutely hated
In fact, a lot of the older Polish community looked down their noses at me for doing that. And here I have to say that it wasn't a program I ever dreamt that I would do, because I'm not a huge fan of reality television. And now it has become a very cruel program. In the beginning it was quite amusing. But the carrot on the end of the stick was that they promised that each of us so-called celebrities would get a percentage of the public's voting through phone, email, text, and we would be able to give it to our favourite charities. The public never knew about this because they thought it would affect their voting.
Absolutely.
But I was promised at least £70,000 for my charities.
Did it materialise?
And that's, sorry?
Did it materialise?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Because it did, because I did the same with I'm a Celebrity in Australia, and they said we will give, you know...
Oh, you had
yes, but you're not allowed to say because it can affect the voting, because people will vote for the charity rather than you. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Pete Burns, who you may remember, who was in there, his charity was plastic surgery that had gone wrong.
Like his, for
Michael
example.
Barrymore. I won't tell you what his lips were constructed with, not in this holy place. Michael Barrymore, oh, you've heard. Michael Barrymore was for recovering alcoholics and drug addicts, which of course I do support as well. And mine was most of it wildlife, which is my second biggest hat. I'm a huge believer that the balance of nature, with the atrocious way that animals are on the verge of extinction now, is going to have an enormous knock-on effect. So the joy of being able to write cheques, probably the only time in my life, £15,000 towards the building of a midwifery school in Tibet. I'm a Buddhist, sorry God. Well, a Buddhist Catholic. Covered from all angles.
Never heard of one.
That's what I put on hospital forms. Buddhist Catholic. £15,000 to my beloved elephant orphanage in Africa, where I have 3 adopted baby elephants. £3,000 to the Siberian Tiger Project, and they really are on their last legs there. I can't remember what for the gorillas and the Cameroons, but you know, it was just such an amazing feeling to be able to do that, that it made those extraordinary 16 days of lunacy in the Big Brother house almost worth it.
Yeah. And George Galloway was rather strangely dressed as a pussycat. Now, for somebody in show business, yes, but for a member of Parliament, a weird thing to do.
Yes, he didn't do himself any favours, sadly. And although I was a huge follower of his when he was head of War on Want, I think he's a highly intelligent man and a very good speaker, but he always trumpeted supporting the underdog. Well, boy, his colours changed in the Big Brother house. And between you and me, you know that every book you bring out, or particularly an autobiography, has to go for legal reading. And I thought, well, they'd pull things out about, I don't know, my marriage ex-marriage and various other things that might have been questionable. The one thing I wasn't allowed to do was call him a bully. I wasn't allowed to use that word, which is pretty extraordinary.
It is, yeah.
I found other ways of saying it, but I wasn't allowed to use that word.
Relatively tame. Especially, I mean, you may have used other words in talking about the previous marriages and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I just said that he came down in my estimation because he was so controlling. He called us brothers and sisters. You know, that's very communist for a start. And he desperately wanted to win. And the amount of sort of ugly scenes that happened, particularly with the young girls, who he really did bully. So,
I think it's more contrived than it was initially. It was just putting people in and seeing what happened, you know, a human mix, which is quite interesting anyway. Now it's very much controlled. We'll have one of those, and
yes, and they set situations up specifically, you know, to get people calling for help. They used to lock the one and only toilet.
They locked it?
They used to lock it, so you had to beg to go to the loo.
Oh, that's demeaning.
They used to control the air temperature. Obviously, we all know they controlled the food. And then for 2 days, they took away caffeine. They took away coffee and tea.
You don't see this, you see. You can't see the change of air temperature.
Well, it's described in detail in there. And it's dehumanizing. You know, it's a bit like sort of Japanese torture at times.
Yeah. So much better working in the soaps. I mean, you worked in two of the most famous soaps. I mean, is that more fun? I mean, I know you get your script probably the day before, and you think, I've got to go to bed and learn
and
this.
And there's no rehearsal.
No rehearsal. You've got to learn it very quickly.
And all the young kids who've been in since the age of 11, you know, they sit there tweeting and Facebooking underneath the tables in between the takes.
Yeah.
And there is absolutely no rehearsal. I mean, I was lucky because with EastEnders it was darling Mike Reid, spelled differently from you. Yeah. And in Coronation, Sue Nichols, and we just hit it off together. It was super fun, but hard work.
It is. And you've got to keep on the treadmill. You can't go and do other things. And there's certain, like our chum Bobby Dabra going, I've got a corporate tonight. I'm sorry, you're an EastEnders mate, and that's it.
Absolutely.
But some roles actually work, and you can see they settle in. They're going to be a long role. Others look uncomfortable. You think they're not in for a long run, this character.
Yeah, I was sort of surprised with my character because that relationship between, you know, older ladies, that sort of love-hate relationship is fairly rare. And I have to say I got an enormous amount of fan mail and people still stop me on the street and say, when's Claudia coming back? Yeah. But, you know, the producers change every 2 years, so...
Well, people can always come back. I mean, Dirty Dan was dead and he came back. An extraordinarily unlikely scenario. Oh, no, actually, he's not that dead.
The final line was, betrayed by the tranny and the granny. I think that's a rather good line to come back on.
It's a wonderful one. Do you enjoy soaps or not?
Watching them?
Well, no, being in them. I mean.
Well, there wasn't enough. I was 1.5 years in Corrie and it was a bubble in EastEnders. It was fun while it lasted, but it wasn't. I would never do it for 15 or 16 years. Yeah. And my favourite is theatre. I love, you know, you get a product, you all work together towards the same end. The friendships and the sort of friction and the excitement and the adventure and everything, and everybody rehearsing, trying things out. You make friends very quickly, you know, they become your family, and if it's a good product and a good cast and it goes down well, there is no greater thrill.
And they always say, don't they, you know, people say to actors, but it's the same every night, it must get boring. And an actor will say, no, I'll make it different every night.
Well, to a certain extent, yes, you never stop trying things out. I mean, obviously, you don't throw your fellow thespians by suddenly, you know, saying something else so they don't know their cue words. But you're constantly looking for some new nuance. And you have to remember that every night is a new audience. So you might have done it for the 85th time, but it's the first time they're seeing the play. So they deserve as good a performance as the first night.
And at the end of every run, it's like, darling, we must keep in touch. We must keep in touch. Give me your email. Give me your email. You must have crew hundreds of them in our business. How do you decide who to stay in touch? Because, you know, we can only have so many friends. As life goes on, you get older, there's probably not room for many new friends.
No, it depends on on how life throws you together later on, you know. I've certainly got a handful of very close friends that I met in theatre who I still see on a regular basis. Or we meet on the charity fronts. And if people are good about keeping in contact, I mean, it's a two-way thing. You know, you can't expect people, no matter how close they were to you when you were working, if you never contact them, or you never write to them, then you should expect them to do the same to you. Yeah. So, if they're important, then I make it a point to keep in touch.
Conservation, you're talking about that. Are you still actively involved? Because I think we're all more aware than we ever were. I mean, and young kids are taught it at school, they're taught ecology, about the planet, more than we ever were. So, do you actively get involved now?
I'm hugely actively involved. At the moment, believe it or not, an elephant gets killed every 15 minutes.
Still?
Still, for their ivory. So there is a huge move now to try and make it forever illegal to trade in ivory products.
Because some people, some cultures presumably won't take any notice of that. I mean, it's like you talk about the
predominantly
whales.
Chinese.
Yeah.
No Chinese here tonight, I hope. The Chinese believe in the power and the magic of animal bits and pieces. And it's been in their history for thousands and thousands of years. So us Westerners going in there and saying, look, rhino horn is the same as your fingernails. It is not going to make you more virile, and it is not going to make your fever go. But you cannot persuade people who have a completely different mentality. So you have to make it illegal throughout the world, and unfortunately because of corruption and because of the huge value of both ivory and rhino horn, the more you make it illegal, the more it's worth, and therefore the more poaching you get. Recently, I've become very active with a charity called Animals Asia, and this again predominantly China and Vietnam. These poor, beautiful brown bears are caged in cages no bigger than that, so the bear cannot stand, it cannot extend its arms or its legs, it bites its own skin, it chews on the bars, and it's got a metal catheter stuck in its stomach, and they milk it for bile, which they then sell for enormous sums of money. This is already cancerous, this bile, because these wounds are infected. And this wonderful woman who single-handedly 20 years ago started these rehabilitation places. And when you see these bears for the first time touch grass, and they just come out of the cage after they've been okayed by the vets and all their wounds have been mended and mostly their teeth have had to be taken out and their skins have been tended, and you just see them stand on this grass. And you can almost see, thank you God for rescuing me. It's unbelievably moving.
But we're much better now with you know, zoos and circuses as they were. We're learning all the time, actually. Well, let's keep the creatures out in the wild. And I thought we were actually getting, I mean, we've introduced red kites back here and stuff like that. So, I mean, we are learning, we are getting better, but say, but there are some cultures that will ignore that.
There are some cultures, and also it's getting a little bit too late now. If things don't radically change, there will be no elephants, there will be no rhinos, and there will be no tigers by 2025.
But surely they can breed. You can get a couple of those and keep breeding in captivity.
No, because those animals you can't reintroduce back into the wild. There isn't any wild, really. There's only protected areas. Yeah. And it's not just poaching, it's human encroachment. Because the population of humans keeps going up. You know, the better technology gets, the longer we live. Whereas in the not that long ago, you know, a child was born seriously ill or deformed, it wouldn't last, the same as in the animal kingdom. But now technology moves on so fast that what would have been, you know, a death sentence 25 years ago no longer is.
No, you're saying about children. I mean, in, you know, Bartholomew Fair that ran for 700 years, for example. One couple had a child with two heads, just took it out, exhibited it there for money. I mean, now, totally and utterly unthinkable. You get a hospital job, it's serious, a newspaper story, but then there was nobody to help back then. At least we're now more aware of helping each other, and try to do something with the planet. Then it was a shrug of the shoulders and 6 months of time to have a look, which is unthinkable.
But even now, I mean, when you look at the wealth in the world, if everybody shared and if everybody was less greedy, there would be plenty enough of everything to go round for everybody in the world. Look at the amount of food that we waste on a daily basis in the Western countries. It would be so simple, and my personal imagination was that if everybody in the world took 5 minutes of stillness or meditation, just 5 minutes, and before the huge powers that be got together in these summit meetings, there was 5 minutes of silence and just being aware that that would make such a difference. You know, people are incredibly greedy, and unnecessarily so. We all have, probably everybody in this room has more than they need. I know that everybody, particularly in this country, is wonderful at supporting charities. But what we need is the fat cats should get less and spread what they have.
Yeah, it's always ideal, a utopian situation, you know, giving everyone 100 quid, and by the end of the year, some will be rich, some will be broke. So, and also as kids, I mean, as kids, you're naughty, because I remember, you know, with Biafra, and it's, you know, there's somebody in Biafra that would like that, and as kids you say, oh, well, put it in an envelope then, Dad, and send it to them. You know, as you do, that's what kids do. But we are becoming more aware.
This country in particular is wonderful with giving to charity.
We're the fourth, I think, we're the fourth most giving charitable country in the world. I mean, Ireland are number 3. We're number 4. So for a small island...
But you know, strangely, it's the poorest people who give on a regular basis.
The widow's mite.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Talking about silence and stillness, something I've never done, but I know that you do, and that is go up in hot air balloons. And I think you're a qualified pilot. I mean, it's extraordinary. I have no idea what the feeling is like, because circumstantially I've never been in one.
Well, the reason I took it up, again, it started with charity, Children in Crisis, and it was the Alka-Seltzer balloon. And we used to do photo shoots to raise money for the charity. And then it was suggested I had a terrible fear of flying. So when we were doing the charity shoots, the balloons were tethered, you know, by a long piece of, not string, but rope or whatever. And so they said that they would train me as a pilot, which is the same as a fixed-wing license, except that you are at the mercy of the wind and about the changes in wind direction, and you have to know about ambient temperature and the weight inside the balloon, and obviously how you pull the burner. And the basket, which is like Aladdin's basket, only comes up to there, not even to your waist. So once you get up to like sort of 500 meters, and you float over woods, for example, that look like broccoli from up there, and you can hear everything. You can hear dogs barking, you can hear people's conversations, and in between the burning, which is very loud, the most complete peaceful silence. It's wonderful. And I flew for about 2 years in this country. It's a very expensive sport and fairly antisocial, because you have to fly early in the mornings and early in the evenings before thermals get up. But once you've flown over the Masai Mara in Africa, then flying over England gets a bit boring.
Wow.
But I flew once with Piers Lindstrom and our dear Virgin boss, who was a very keen hot air balloonist. And there's a game when you're hot air ballooning called the Hare and the Hound. So one balloon takes off and drops a marker, and the other balloons have to get as close to it as they can. And Mr. Virgin Boss decided that it would be fun to land the balloon on the M4. Not a very clever idea. We nearly had a multi-pilot, but luckily we skimmed and landed in a field next door.
So I always wonder how they land it in place, because it looks a bit haphazard. You're travelling, you don't get any wind because you're travelling with
You don't know how you're travelling until you get close to the ground.
Yeah.
So then you deflate a bit, you deflate a bit, you deflate a bit, and the closer you get to the ground, sometimes you close your eyes and you land like a feather. But other times, The ground is racing away behind you. You have to be careful not to set fire to the envelope. And suddenly you're in a chariot being dragged across these fields and hoping you don't hit barbed wire or something like that. I've had some fairly...
Oh, do you have to pay the farmer? Is that a tradition? You pay the farmer for landing in his field?
Well, yeah, you have to try and be careful not to land amongst his pigs or his chickens or his horses or whatever. You can be fined big bucks.
Terrifying stuff. I mean, it's quite interesting. Do you have to keep it up? Have you got a license? Do you have to go and do so many hours a year?
No, mine's expired. You have to do 35 hours a year.
Right. You always imagine you're going to hit trees. I always think you
That's
must...
most dangerous. That and
pilots,
pilots,
yeah.
And taking off, mass takeoffs like they do in Bristol every year. About 340 balloons taking off at once. Mm-hmm. That's pretty hairy.
I did the Bristol balloon thing one year, and they had about 300 of them. Yeah,
wonderful.
I know that in a minute you're going to sign some of your books, but what was the most difficult part of writing it? What was the bit where you thought, I'm really not sure that I can put this in, or I want to put it in? Were there any of those parts?
No, there were quite a few of those moments. I mean, obviously my ex-marriage, which reliving the good and the bad, and desperately trying to be fair and balanced with all the nastiness that has been written in the papers. That was hard. The challenge of memory was really hard, particularly because I've never actually kept diaries. And you know how often you remember things and then you question whether they are actually things you remember or whether it's because people have told you. I was very aware of honouring my daughter, my grandson, my siblings, everybody who's left of my family, writing in the correct vein, even though giving away certain secrets. But I have to say, as soon as the book was finished, I went into a bit of a depression, and I just asked myself, why have I done this? Who have I actually done this for? Why have I written, parts of my life? And I still haven't found the answer.
Well, it's probably a cathartic thing, isn't it? Autobiography is often cathartic.
And it is a hell of a sense of satisfaction to actually hold the book in your hand and think, blimey, I've actually written a book.
Do you want to keep tinkering with it, though? Do you think, I've missed a bit out, somebody told me
ever since
that story.
It's finished, hundreds of things I wish I'd put in, and a few I wish I'd kept out. Too late now. And
the photographs, always do. You must have a lot of family photographs. You're obviously very proud of your family. Again, it's what to put in, what to leave out, how many showbiz celebrities can you stand next to in the book?
And it's dedicated to the two most precious women in my life, my mother and my daughter. And when I had the dubious honour in 1995 of being caught out for This Is Your Life, and it was not at a very good time in my life, both marriage-wise, and both my parents were very unwell, but they made it to the show. And it's the last living footage I have of both of them. I've never been able to watch it again. And my daughter, who is the most wonderful girl, and she's given me the most delicious grandson. And last week she saved my life. I came back from doing one of these at the Polish Hearth in South Kensington in London, got back home, central heating had conked out, freezing cold in the bedroom, so I lit a little electric fire. I went downstairs, make a cup of tea, feed the cat, various things, and the next thing I know is the house is full of smoke. I run up the stairs and this heater is, the flames going up to the ceiling. Really terrifying. And what did I do? I threw water at it, which is a number one no-no with an electric fire. But I managed to put it out. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, so I thought I'm not going to bother with the fire engine. And then, even more stupidly, having aired the place really well, I collapsed into my bed in the same room as the fire had been. And my daughter rings and rings and rings and rings the following morning and can't wake me up. So in the end she comes scooting around, wakes me up, notices the black soot all over the counterpane on the bed, etc., and freaked out cat downstairs, calls the ambulance. Now, don't argue with me, Mama, you are going to the hospital right now, they've got to do a check, chest x-ray, they've got to check you've got no carbon dioxide in the blood, blah, 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 blah. And all of this because she came around just to make sure Mama was okay.
Saved your life.
She did. Yeah.
Well, we're pleased she did, because we're here tonight. Otherwise, they'd be sitting here talking to nobody, which would have been absolutely appalling. So, ladies and gentlemen, Rula Lenska.
Tell you a little secret. When I was a little girl in boarding school with nuns, I always wanted to be a nun because I liked the smell of incense.
So I think, bless you, thank you so much. So Rula's here if you want a quick chat, I guess, or
yes.
Mel, you.
Yeah.